welcome to the ATAR Notes Psych 3-4 lecture for Unit 4. So going into all of the stuff that you're about to learn next term and next semester. My name's Loz. I'll be running through the lecture with you today. Before we do get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting from today, so the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm sure some of you may be familiar with the ATAR Notes lectures. You may have attended some earlier in the week or earlier this year. But essentially, ATAR Notes, we have a lot of resources available to, students in VCE and across Australia. They are essentially all sort of resources for you guys that are created by past students. So some of these resources include obviously these lectures that you're attending, but you may be familiar with study notes, the discussion forums. I'm sure you guys are starting, to get into ATAR calculators around this time of year and around the upcoming months as well. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff on our website. You can feel free to take a look. They're all free and they're available to you. You just have to register for an account and you can access all of these. Psych is a pretty popular subject. So there's a lot of stuff on there. There's a lot of sort of input from past students as well who, have been in your shoes and all of that. So there's a lot of stuff that you can have a look at if you are interested. If you are interested in a little bit more than those resources, there are a couple more things. So TuteSmart is the tutoring company run by ATAR Notes. So I tutor there, I tutor, psych and bio with our study guides. Those are all available and they're also available on the platform Ed Unlimited. So Ed Unlimited is essentially you can access it, through your tablet or through your laptop, and it's got all of the ATAR Notes publications, so the study guides, topic tests, course notes, that sort of thing, and also a lot of NEEP practice, past exams. They're all available to you through Ed Unlimited. So if you are interested, you can also feel free to have a look at those as well. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to cover today, as I mentioned, we're going to be going over Unit 4. So we'll do both areas of study. So first we'll begin with sleep and then move into area of study 2, which is on kind of mental health, mental well-being, and then finally looking at sort of the area of study 3, which obviously goes across the whole year, so you might be familiar with it already, but all the practical investigation, sort of research method stuff. So yeah, that's essentially what we'll be covering. We've got 2 hours. We'll cover that in that time with questions. Pop them into the live chat, and then you'll get a response to those. And if you don't get everything, because there is obviously a lot of content to get through, if you don't get everything as I'm saying it, it's fine. You'll be able to access this and the slides after the lecture as well. But yeah, any questions that you have, as soon as you think of them, just chuck them in the live chat, and those will be answered as well. In terms of myself, with psych, I did psych when I was in year 11. So I did psych 3-4 in year 11, which was in 2019. So I graduated in 2020. I really enjoyed psych. I got a 50 in psych. It was one of my best subjects, and I really think I did well in it because I just liked the subject. So I think because I did it in year 11 as well, I had a bit of time, to allocate that and obviously prioritize that compared to my other year 11 subjects. But I think, yeah, because I had a kind of a big interest in it, I was like eager to study it, is what I think. But yeah, the same goes for you guys, even if it's not your favorite subject or if you're not as interested in it as I was, if you just put in a bit of effort, you can definitely do well. I think sometimes it's maybe a misconception that because psych is such a popular subject and a lot of students do it, that it might be harder to do well. But yeah, as long as you, put in effort, you revise the stuff that you, have done in in Unit 3, and going into Unit 4, kind of keeping everything up to date, not falling behind, and focusing especially on the exam. There's no reason why you guys can't do well, especially, at this point in time during the middle of the year. If you may not have done as well during the beginning of the year, over the past 2 terms, there's no reason why you can't really improve your grades. And again, focusing on that really important exam can definitely get you a good score in the end. Yeah, I think we'll kind of go through sort of exam strategies and study tips towards the end, but any questions on that, please just pop it in the chat and then we can answer them throughout. Yeah, so that's what we will be looking at in this lecture today. So beginning with sleep, so obviously with this year, we've had a change in the study design. So honestly, I would say that Unit 4 hasn't been changed that much. I would say stuff has been taken out. So in the previous study design, um, as opposed to this year where this study design is kind of entirely on sleep, last year it was on consciousness and sleep. So kind of the stuff that we're looking at on this slide, there was a lot more detail on this. So it's kind of a good thing for you guys. You don't really have to worry about the nature of, consciousness as much. You just have to know about it relating to sleep. So I think that's obviously a big change. So when you use past exams or past resources, if you see stuff that's delving into consciousness a little bit too much, don't, get too sidetracked. That's relating to previous years. And in terms of mental well-being, hasn't really been changed too much either. Again, a lot of stuff has been taken out. So a lot of stuff to do with kind of mental health disorders and risk factors for that, that's been kind of removed. So I would say Unit 4 is a little bit, I would say maybe better compared to Unit 3 in terms of study design changes, because I think there was more changes in Unit 3 compared to Unit 4. And that means that doing past exams as well should be pretty good for you, because you'll be able to read questions and then know that, this is obviously material that you haven't studied, so you don't need to answer it. Because again, most of it has been taken out rather than added in. So hopefully, using past exams, from 2022 and beforehand, they'll still be beneficial to you guys. Okay, hopefully that has kind of all made sense in terms of our actual stuff on sleep. So beginning with the definition of what it is, again, we relate it a little bit to consciousness. So it's this idea that sleep is what we would call an altered state of consciousness. So consciousness, this idea of, essentially being awake, what we're comprehending, what's in our mind, ultimately, it exists on a bit of a continuum. So we generally are in this state of normal waking consciousness, and it's this idea of when we're alert and when we're awake. And then we can kind of slip and slide, because again, think of this idea of being on a continuum, into different levels of consciousness. And that kind of is when we enter this sort of realm of altered states of consciousness. So again, as the name suggests, it's basically anything that is sort of outside of our normal waking kind of alert stage. So obviously sleep, we're not, awake and alert during that. So that's why it's an altered state of consciousness. So going into these a little bit more, so the definitions of these are here. The definitions aren't like a big thing to be aware of. I think I always say psych is a very application-based subject. So all of your questions are all applying it to a situation. You rarely get a question saying, what is the definition of normal waking consciousness? Or what is the definition of, operant conditioning or something like that. You will get a scenario, so-and-so goes for a walk in the park, blah, 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 blah. Is this an example of classical conditioning or operant conditioning? Or, explain the stages of classical conditioning in this scenario. It's all this idea of, your theory and you have to apply it to a situation that's given to you. That's really what psych is, both in multiple choice and short answer. So be very, very comfortable with approaching questions in that manner, as opposed to, sort of definition-based questions. So again, I like to speak of them relatively generally, but yeah, normal waking consciousness, just think of it being awake. Altered state of consciousness, everything that's not that, really. It encapsulates sort of a lot of stuff. So there are obviously a lot of examples. We're thinking about sleep, so you want to be thinking about it being naturally occurring. You don't have to take something or, do this particular action for you to go to sleep. It's something that occurs naturally and it's something that occurs regularly. Whereas the other type of altered state of consciousness is an induced altered state of consciousness. So that's when we might be, in meditation, that can be seen as an altered state of consciousness, drug-induced altered state of consciousness. So, stimulants, depressants, that kind of variation there. Also, food, that idea of sometimes, hallucinations when we're low on food. So that's that idea of entering an altered state of consciousness when you're not in that sort of present, awake and alert phase, and you've sort of taken something or, something has occurred that has caused you to sort of enter this altered state of consciousness. So you generally think about, your mind not necessarily thinking straight, or this idea of your perception might change. So, your, if you think of hallucinations or something, that idea of sort of sensory stimuli that isn't actually present, that sort of thing. And again, when you think about sleep, that the same thing can happen. Like, when you dream or you're not very aware of everything that's going on in your surroundings, that's that idea of being in an altered state of consciousness. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. Okay, so in terms of this idea of measuring sleep, so we have this sort of classification of measuring the physiological responses of sleep. So physiological just meaning, relating to the body ultimately. So we've got 3 of these sorts of devices. So the first of these is an EEG. So we can see here they have quite long names. The rule of thumb is if they are shortened or abbreviated on the study design, you can refer to it as that abbreviation. So for example, if I had a short answer question, on the study design, the electroencephalograph is written just like we've got in pink here, electroencephalograph in brackets EEG. That's how it's written on the study design. It's got that little EEG acronym on the study design. Therefore, say I'm in the exam and I'm about to write about an EEG, I can just call it an EEG. I don't have to say electroencephalograph in brackets EEG, blah, blah, blah. I can just say EEG because VCA has abbreviated it on the study design. The opposite example of this is when there might be a common acronym, but it's not outlined on the study design. So for example, with classical conditioning, I believe. So, you might be talking about the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and we often shorten that to like, UCS or NS, but VCA doesn't abbreviate it like that on the study design. Therefore, if I was to answer a question and I want to use, UCS, let's say it's quite a long question, so I'm going to be saying UCS a lot of times. I obviously don't want to be writing out unconditioned stimulus, because it's just a waste of time. In that case, I have to define it first. So I would write unconditioned stimulus in brackets UCS, and then from then on in that question, I can just call it a UCS. I don't have to write out the full thing. Hopefully that makes sense. So the rule of thumb is if it's shortened on the study design, you don't have to define it and shorten it yourself. If it's not an acronym on the study design, you have to write it out first, because technically, if you were to just write UCS, VCAR, the idea is that, they don't know what you're talking about. They might not know, you might think unconditioned stimulus stands for something else. So I don't know, it might depend how nitpicky your examiner is, but just to be safe, always do that. That's the general kind of rule to go by. Okay, so moving aside from that, in terms of what we're actually looking at, so your EEG, your EMG, and your EOG, they're measuring these physiological responses of the body. So they're detecting the electrical activity of these 3 separate things. So the EEG is measuring the activity of your brain. The EMG is detecting the activity of your muscles, and the EOG is ultimately detecting the movement of your eyes, but it does that by detecting the muscles that control eye movements. So with these, the whole idea is, obviously they're called electromyograph, electrooculograph. We're thinking about electrical activity. It's how they pick up information. With the eyes, your eyes, aren't, conducting that electrical activity. So they observe or detect the electrical activity of the muscles that control the movement of your eyes. So it's kind of an indirect way. It's really important to write that in your questions. If you write detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the eyes, that's incorrect because it's not recording electrical activity of the eyes. If you've seen, they use electrodes. So, when, like with an EEG, you have the electrodes kind of all over the brain. With an EOG, you have them sort of like around the eyes because, again, it's the muscles. If you were to say detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity of the eyes, that would almost imply that you're putting electrodes on the eyeballs. So again, it's just a bit of a nitpicky thing. This is probably the most specific psych gets. Like usually, they're very lenient with the terms you use and things like that. And, just what I was saying before about how nothing's really very definition based and, knowing the definition of specific terms isn't such a huge thing. But in this case, it is so important that you always use this acronym. You have to always use these terms. Detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity. Always use that. I don't know why, but VCAR are just very, very picky when it comes to this. So EEG, dare of the brain. EMG is dare of the muscles. So generally think about muscles in the body. And then the EOGs, specifically the muscles that control eye movements. So we'll talk about the stages of sleep in terms of REM and NREM. Those are your two major stages. The idea is that with the three of these, you can kind of detect what stage or sort of how deep someone is sleeping based on these. So we'll come back to this idea when we go through them, but it's just really important to understand that you've got brain, muscles, and muscles that control eye movements. The way I used to remember this is EOG. So the O looks like an eyeball. So that's how I remember it's an eye. Or if you can remember oculo, again, think of an eye. And then EMG, M for muscles. And then I just remember that EEG is the one that's left over. So the brain. Yeah, really, really important. Again, just overemphasizing this idea of detects, amplifies, and records electrical activity. Make sure you know that. So the other two methods we have of measuring sleep are a little bit more subjective. So this is self-reporting or sleep diaries. So if you have someone that's doing a sleep study, so you'll hook them up to all of these sort of electrodes. And that's obviously a little bit more objective because it's very scientific. What's recorded is what's recorded. The graph that it gives you, it's the data that it gives you. So that's quite objective. Whereas with sleep diaries and video monitoring, these are a little bit more subjective because they're sort of open to interpretation. They don't directly tell us information relating to sleep. So with the sleep diary, obviously the person is, noting their own experiences. That can be very subjective. It's very open to bias. It's obviously very helpful because, you can't use electrodes to figure out how a person was feeling before bed or, what the stresses of the day were or, how refreshed they feel upon waking. Those are some really important things that a sleep diary is good for. But it's just important to understand that, they may get the same hours of sleep. They may be technically, as in two different people may be technically the same level of refreshed, but based on their personal experiences, one may think, oh no, I still feel exhausted, I'm still tired. One may think, oh, I'm so refreshed, I'm the freshest I've ever been. So it's this idea of just being aware that it's not a very objective, i.e. it's subjective, and that, interpretations will differ slightly. So with video monitoring, it's kind of the same thing. You basically just video someone while they're asleep. And this is sort of when you're looking for things like maybe seizures or sleepwalking, that sort of thing. And the idea of it being subjective is just because, again, it's a little bit open to interpretation. So this idea of if someone's moving a lot, what that says about their sleep. Oh, they must be having a bad sleep. It must be this, that. So I would say it's probably less subjective than self-reporting because the video is in front of you. But it relies on the person that's watching the video to interpret what they think is going on. And that's why it's a little bit more subjective as opposed to your electrodes. They produce graphs that have little waves on them. And then that's what it is. It's kind of data. It's more, objective sort of. I know it's not technically numbers, but a little bit more numerical data. Okay, so we talked about this idea of it being defined as a naturally occurring altered state of consciousness. So we then have the two types of sleep. So we've got our REM, so our rapid eye movement sleep, and our NREM, which is our non-rapid eye movement. So very much in the name. And again, this is what I was talking about when we're thinking about EOG. So we can distinguish if someone is in REM sleep or in NREM sleep based on how rapidly or what the EOG is showing. So in rapid eye movement sleep, so in REM sleep, that EOG, it's going to be going like crazy. The waves are going to be really fast and frequent. In your NREM sleep, the eyes aren't really moving, or they're moving a little bit more slowly. So that graph is just going to be, smaller waves are going to be less frequent. It's going to show that the muscles that control the eyes aren't moving as much as they are in REM sleep. Okay, so REM sleep, we spend a shorter amount of time. So it's about a quarter or a fifth. So less than NREM. Obviously the the hallmark factor of this is that idea of our rapid eye movement. So your eyes are obviously closed, but under it, your eyeballs are just sort of wiggling around. REM sleep is what we associate with dreaming. So with our NREM sleep, we can kind of think about certain stages of that as your deeper sleep. REM sleep isn't necessarily like light sleep, but it's just what we associate more with dreaming. And so dreaming and deep sleep, we don't really think of them sort of being in the same stages. So yeah, those are our kind of main characteristics of REM sleep. In terms of the actual time, so we have we'll talk about circadian rhythms and ultradian rhythms in a second. Over the course of the night, we'll have different episodes of REM sleep. So basically let's say we sleep for 8 hours, over that time, you'll go into NREM sleep and then REM sleep and then NREM sleep and then REM sleep. You just kind of cycle through the two types. Each time that you cycle through REM sleep, they get longer. So at the start of the night, NREM sleep and then REM sleep, that little portion of REM sleep may only be for a couple of minutes, really short. And then you go NREM sleep and then you go REM sleep, it'll be a bit longer. And then NREM and then REM and then NREM and then REM. By the last sort of period of REM sleep, so you're getting towards waking up, towards the morning, it'll be a lot longer. So that's the idea that as you sleep, as you go through your sleep episode, your REM cycle basically gets a little bit longer each time. The last one is here just as a little bit of an FYI. When we get to NREM again, we'll talk about brainwaves. So brainwaves are what would be picked up on an EEG. So we talked about, detecting electrical activity of the brain. It's not required for you to know the exact brainwave types. So I wouldn't, flag these and make sure you note these down. You will see it in a lot of textbooks. You might see it in some older past questions. But I think it's just something that you can have a read of, but not something that is super duper important. But ultimately, the way that an EEG can kind of figure out what stage you're in is based on how sort of fast your brain is moving or the electrical activity. So we have sort of this progression of sort of high activity brain waves and obviously down to lower. So as you go into deep sleep, obviously the brain is slowing down and you get those sort of slower waves. Whereas when you are awake, like so right now, you would expect in my brain, hopefully, the brain waves are moving a little bit faster. So these fast waves are called beta brain waves. So they're associated with, sort of higher brain activity. And that's what you kind of see in REM sleep. So it's this idea that the brain is pretty active. And then you go from beta to alpha to theta to delta. So delta is your slowest. And those are the ones that you see in your deep sleep. So again, this is just more of a sort of an FYI, but you commonly come across it. And for that reason, we call REM sleep paradoxical sleep. So it's a bit of a paradox because it's, we see the brain or the body working a little bit faster or being a little bit more active. But in REM sleep, you're ultimately like paralyzed, like you don't really move. Compared to deep sleep, where you might like toss and turn. In REM sleep, you don't really move at all. So yeah, internal active, that idea of your heart rate might be going a little bit faster than NREM. The idea that your brain is kind of ticking a little bit faster, but externally you're sort of frozen. So it's that idea of a paradoxical sleep. Okay, if we compare that to NREM, so NREM obviously makes up the majority of our sleep. So it's about 3/4 to 4/5 for adults, being aware that sleep changes as you age. But yeah, so it's kind of about a 3/4, 1/4 sort of thing that goes on. So just remember that you are mostly in NREM. So we have 4 stages of NREM sleep. And so we go from stage 1 to stage 4, with stage 1 being the lightest and stage 4 being the deepest. So stage 1 is when we're just kind of almost transitioning into sleep. So it's a very light sleep. You can still be woken up. But yeah, that's kind of the first stage. And you don't spend that long in there. So stage 2, you kind of spend a decent amount of time in. So in the first cycle, you don't really need to know these specific minutes, but in the first sleep cycle, so that first portion of NREM of the night, you spend a decent time in stage 2, and then similar to REM, as the night goes on, you spend a little bit more time in stage 2. We have a nice graph coming up that'll hopefully make things a little bit more easier to comprehend. But yeah, stage 2 is kind of where you spend a decent amount of your NREM sleep. In terms of your brain waves for these two, again, you're kind of just going from those, like sort of those lighter ones. So those, remembering that beta are your fast ones, and then it's kind of alpha and theta. Again, we've popped them in grey because it's not a major thing to be aware of, but your teacher may discuss it. You may see it in your textbooks. If it's on your SACs, again, it just depends what school you go to, your teacher, things like that. But if you never hear about it in class, then don't really worry about it too much. But it's that idea that, as you would expect, when you go to sleep, your brain is just slowing down a little bit. Okay, so stage 3 and 4 are our deep sleep. So stage 4 is obviously the deepest, but when you use the term deep sleep, you're kind of collectively referring to stage 3 and stage 4. So this is when you're getting into your kind of real proper sleep, and this is when you get quite hard to wake. So your kind of body goes through all the things again. Everything is just basically slowing down, and you sort of get a bit of those delta waves coming in because you're going into deep sleep until you hit stage 4, where you are in your proper deep sleep, you know, like sleeping like a log, that kind of thing. So kind of minimal movement, you've got a lot of these delta waves, and you're really hard to wake. So when you have to like shake someone to wake them up or scream really loud, they're probably not in stage 2. Stage 2, you're kind of a little bit easier to wake up. Whereas your stage 3 and your stage 4, if you have to shake someone to wake them up, they're probably in, you know, one of these deeper stages of sleep, maybe even stage 4, because of that idea that they need a lot of sort of external stimuli to actually get them out of their sleep. Yeah, but that's these general stages. Okay, so this is a really nice diagram that kind of summarizes or sort of, explains those stages. And it shows you your cycle. So again, we'll define the Ultradian rhythm in a second. But here you have the start of the night. So this is your hours. So again, you get about 8 hours of sleep. So the purple is your REM, and then all of these are your NREM. So the gray is your NREM, the purple is your REM. You can see that you obviously spend a lot more time in your NREM. So that's that 80%, let's say, and the purple is about 20%. And this is of an adult. So you ultimately enter sleep, you know, you're in stage 1, stage 2, and you spend a decent amount in deep sleep towards the beginning of the night. As you can see, as you go on into the sort of, you know, 8th hour and longer into the night, you get less deep sleep. So you can see by the time you're on your 3rd, 4th, and 5th sleep cycles, you're actually not getting into that stage 4. So your deep sleep is mainly towards the start of the night. And that's why when I was referring to this point here, when I said NREM stage 2 lengthens with each successive cycle, it's kind of complementary to that, because you're getting less deep sleep, you're ultimately going to get more sort of stage 2. And you can see that in here we're spending a nice time in stage 2, and by cycle 4 and cycle 5, it's all really stage 2. You can also see quite nicely with the purple, you can see that in your first cycle, your first REM period is really short. Then cycle 2, you know, gets a bit longer. By your last cycle, you can see that your final REM period is a lot longer. So as the night goes on, that REM period increases. And you can see that I remember this is something, you know, my teacher told me, it always stuck in my head and helped me remember. Like it's sort of the last stage before waking. So if you wake up naturally, that's why sometimes you might be able to remember your dream as you wake up, or it might feel like, oh my gosh, I feel like I was just dreaming, because you probably were, because you usually, like naturally, you would wake up sort of exiting that REM period and exiting, you know, maybe if you're dreaming during that time. Whereas if you use an alarm, you might be sort of woken up out of stage 4, and then you'll be a bit groggier and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so these are kind of the key points summarized. So we talked about how the length of the sleep cycles increase slightly. So you can see that with these, so cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, that idea that they extend a little bit. Important things to remember are the next 2 dot points. So your deep sleep decreases, as we talked about with stage 3 and stage 4. As the night goes on, you get less and less of that. And then your REM sleep periods increase as the night goes on. So hopefully that makes sense and that graph shows up pretty nicely. Okay, so in terms of our rhythm, so sleep is a biological rhythm, that idea of it being controlled by a biological clock and things like that. So generally it's about 24 hours, which makes sense because we sleep, usually once in a 24-hour period. And we sort of separate this between our circadian and our ultradian rhythms. So our circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle. So circadian rhythm isn't just sleep, like you have other circadian rhythms, but by definition, it is sort of a 24-hour cycle. So sleep fits into that category quite nicely because, again, in 24 hours, we sleep at night and we wake up during the day, and then it repeats. That cycle repeats every 24 hours. So we have these sort of cues. So our zeitgebers, I hope I'm saying that right. But these are our sort of sleep cues that occur within the environment that help tell our body when it's time to be awake and when it's time to sleep. So we'll talk about these towards the end of this section. But for example, light, clocks, meal times, noise, they all work to tell our body, what time of the day is it? And, is it time for bed? Is it time to be awake or is it time to be asleep? And sort of sticking to this circadian rhythm. So when those cues are a little bit out, for example, like if you're coming back from a flight, if you're jet lagged, that sort of thing, if those cues are a little bit out, that can throw off your circadian rhythm and throw off your sleep cycle ultimately. This is more like a bit of a fun fact. If you keep people, so basically I think they kept people in a room and they took away all these cues, so took away lights, clocks, meal times, whatever. They found that, once these people got into a rhythm of sleeping regularly, it fits more towards a 25-hour cycle than 24. But yeah, that's more just something to be aware of. That I remember this point because when you think about jet lag, and we can kind of discuss this when we get into circadian rhythm phase disorders, but with jet lag, often you'll find that they always use the term west is best, because if you travel west, so for example, if you travel from Australia, okay, I'm trying to think. So for example, I came back from a trip a couple days ago. So I went to Europe. So when I went to Europe, I was traveling west, right? So I was traveling west, and it's to do with the sun and whatever. But this idea is that the day gets longer because you travel back in time. So obviously Europe is behind Australia. So when I traveled there, the day got longer. I went back in time, I guess. And because the day is longer, we're able to adjust a little bit easier because it extends the day. So it goes towards that, 25-hour cycle. And we prefer our bodies prefer if the day is extended, and sometimes we can get used to that a bit more quickly compared to if we're coming east and the day shortens. So obviously you're coming east, you're kind of losing time. And the idea is that the day gets shorter. So rather than having to stay awake a little bit longer, you're probably going to have to go to sleep a little bit earlier, if that makes sense. And so that's why traveling east, sometimes people find that they adjust a little bit worse. Yeah, obviously different people experience different things, but I think that's always something that stuck in my head and always made me remember that stuff about jet lag and 25-hour cycles and all that sort of thing. Okay, so this idea of light, so light is kind of our strongest cue for sleep. And it works by influencing the release of melatonin. So melatonin is the sleep hormone. So light basically tells the body when to release melatonin. So melatonin will make us feel sleepy, and when to sort of inhibit that. So you need to know these areas of the brain. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN, is part of your hypothalamus. So if you're familiar with the hypothalamus, very important in maintaining homeostasis and coordinating release of hormones and just making sure that the body is regulated and working nicely. So a portion of that is obviously to do with sleep, and this is the idea of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So the SCN basically will get this input, depending on how much light we're seeing, and it will send messages to the pineal gland. So the pineal gland, a gland is anything that can release hormones. So the pineal gland does that. It releases melatonin. So the SCN, and this is again, like if you've looked at stuff with hypothalamus maybe in previous years in science, um, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is part of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus kind of sits up here, just tells people what to do, gets information, tells people what to do. So that's the role of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And then it gets the, I guess, like orders, or, it says like, okay, there's a lot of light coming in. I have to go and do something. Let me, tell like the little people. I kind of think about it like the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a bit higher in the brain, like it sort of sits on the throne or whatever. And then it tells its, little pineal gland, like, hey, there's a lot of light. I'm, seeing a lot of light. Do not release that melatonin. Don't make me sleepy. The light is on, which means that I'm obviously, it's daytime. I'm meant to be awake. That's what it's saying. Then the pineal gland goes, okay, cool. I'm not going to release any melatonin. The SCN told me not to because it's light out. Obviously, I don't want to be tired if it's daylight. And that's the idea. And then you don't get drowsy. Whereas the other flip side would be the SCN realizes it's very dark. It's not getting a lot of light input. It tells the pineal gland, okay, it's dark. Release the melatonin. Make me drowsy. It's time for bed. So that is the idea there. So obviously more melatonin means more sleepy. Less melatonin means less sleepy. So that's the idea there. So obviously you'd have a lot of higher melatonin around bedtime. Okay, so that's your circadian rhythm. Your ultradian rhythm, if we compare the definitions, is less than 24 hours. So your circadian rhythm is over a 24-hour period. Ultradian rhythm, by definition, again, you can imagine there's a lot of bodily functions that would fit into an ultradian rhythm, is any sort of cycle that lasts less than 24 hours. So when we're thinking about ultradian rhythms, we're thinking about those individual sleep cycles. So these go for about 90 minutes, hence less than 24 hours. I'll flip back to the little graph here. So you can see cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3. So each of these is an ultradian rhythm. So 5 cycles here, each are an ultradian rhythm. You can see that they're about 90 minutes-ish. Okay, yeah, so that's what we're talking about there. So a good thing to remember, I feel like sometimes it can be confusing to think about, but an ultradian rhythm, it's your NREM and your REM. So just like we saw in that little graph there, REM, NREM, 1, 2, 3, 4. REM, 1, 2, 3, 4, REM, 1, 2, 3, 4, REM, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the REM and the NREM together, that is one sleep cycle, that is one ultradian rhythm. It's not, NREM stage 1 and then stage 2, or it's not NREM 1 to 4 and then REM is different and then NREM is different. One block of REM and NREM, one cycle. The next block of REM and NREM, the next cycle, so on. Okay, hopefully that is making sense. In terms of sleep across the lifespan, this is also an important thing for you to be aware of. You basically have to know what sleep looks like as an infant, as a child, an adolescent, an adult, and then as an elderly person. And you can be expected to get questions asking, blah, 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 is a 64-year-old, blah, 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 is a 24-year-old. What would the difference be in their sleep cycle? Like how much sleep would they get? Would their NREM be different? I think often they'll show you little graphs, like bar graphs maybe, saying like, oh, this is the amount of NREM they got, this is the amount of REM, or, this is the hours that they got, something like that. Which one belongs to the 6-month-old? Which one belongs to the 20-year-old? Something like that. Okay, so in terms of this, we have a nice graph coming up as well, which should help visualize it. But as you grow older, your sleep time decreases. So when you're just born, you spend heaps of time asleep, so about 16 hours. This can be fragmented, but all in all, in 24 hours, you spend 16 hours asleep. And as you age, it's obviously less and less. And by the time you are, like an adult, like 20 to 30, I guess, whatever, that's about 8 hours-ish. And then as you get older, so become elderly, it can be 6 hours. So obviously to a young adult, 6 hours might not be enough. They might be sleep deprived, whereas 6 hours can be enough for someone who's elderly. Okay, so the amount of time spent in REM also decreases. So I want you to really separate the kind of key points in the graph we looked at before and sleep across the lifespan, because otherwise you're going to get confused, because the other one is like REM increases, now it decreases. So you have to remember that looking at one night, so one night, not the lifespan, looking at, let's say, a young adult in their sleep episode over one night, your period of REM increases, right? As in like the time spent. So maybe it's 5 minutes in cycle 1, maybe it's 10 minutes cycle 2, maybe it's 15 minutes cycle 3, and so on. When we're looking at the lifespan, so we're going from a baby to an adult to an elderly person, along that trend, your REM sleep decreases. So when you are a baby, when you're sleeping 16 hours a day, you have about 50% of that in REM. So that's about 8 hours in REM. So the proportion of REM is very high. As we talked about before, in a normal adult, it gets to about 20-25%. So, we've gone from in infancy, you're about 50-50 as an infant, 50-50 NREM to REM. As an adult, you're about 75-25. And then it kind of stays on that 75-25, 80-20 level as you age. So remember that REM sleep decreases the proportion. I feel like this is a nice word to think about so you don't get confused. I always used to try to think in my head when I was thinking of these questions, am I thinking about time or am I thinking about proportion? So with the other graph that we looked at, when you go to sleep over one night, the time, so the amount of your REM sleep is increasing. As you age, the proportion of your REM sleep is decreasing. So before, the proportion was half of your time in sleep was spent in REM, and then now it's a quarter, and then now it's like a fifth. So proportion as opposed to time can be a good way to remember that in your head. Okay. And then as people age, deep sleep decreases. That you can kind of think about that as well, because as the night goes on, your NREM, your deep stages of NREM decreases. And as you age, your deep stages of NREM decrease as well. So as you become elderly, often elderly people don't sleep very well generally. They're frequently woken. They wake up quite frequently in the night. And their deep sleep is not, they don't really have that much deep sleep. And yeah, that's just how it goes across the lifespan. Okay, so this is a lovely diagram that shows that. So you can see that so your REM sleep is purple, and you can see as a neonate or an infant, yeah. You can see that it's about 8 hours in NREM and about 8 hours in REM. So it's that idea of 50-50. And then as you get to, let's say an adult around here, you're about 20%, 25-ish. And you're getting about 8 hours-ish of sleep as well. And then as you become older, you can see that this number just dwindles. You get less and less hours of sleep. So by the time, 50, you're getting 6 hours. 50 isn't even that old. But, I think of 80-year-olds when I think of this, 6 hours of sleep. And within this is your NREM, but your NREM 3-4, your deep stages of sleep, would be really quite low. Yes, hopefully that is all making sense. Okay, so what we've just talked about is essentially when sleep goes really well, when you're getting the perfect amounts of sleep, what your typical expected sleep patterns should look like. When you are deprived of sleep, it can lead to a number of consequences or changes, or symptoms even. So what we classify sleep deprivation is you've got inadequate quality or quantity. So quantity, maybe, when you get sleep, the sleep is great, but you're just not getting enough of it. Or maybe you're getting enough sleep, but you're not getting much deep sleep, you're waking up frequently. Yeah, that's the idea there. So in the study design, we specify this to partial sleep deprivation, because obviously you can be sleep deprived for a week or something like that, or I don't know, however long you can go without sleeping. But partial sleep deprivation is when we're thinking about, you're getting sleep every night, but maybe you're just sleeping a little bit less than you should be. So that's that idea of partial sleep deprivation. You're not being totally sleep deprived for 3 days. Okay. So that's kind of what we've just explained there. So the categories that you think about in terms of effects of sleep deprivation, you're thinking of your ABCs. So your affective, behavioral, and cognitive. So affective as in your emotions, behavioral behavior, cognitive, your kind of mental thinking. Okay, so your effective functioning. So when you are sleep deprived, I'm sure you guys are all very aware, you can get a little bit more um, sensitive. You know, you might be a little bit more easy to anger or easy to get sad. It's just this idea that you basically have less emotional control. Sometimes we think of this being linked particularly to REM sleep, but it's not a very, big thing. Like, you just get not enough sleep, you're going to have not issues, but you might find yourself getting a little bit more emotional or more, expressive than you usually are. So very quick to become emotional, the exaggerated responses as well, and kind of this sort of struggle to control your emotions. And that's, lots of personal emotional stuff, but also in terms of interpreting other people's emotions, that can be affected as well. And I guess that ties into sort of cognitive functioning and that sort of thing. Um, but it's this idea that you may, could misinterpret someone else's emotions and then you respond in a way that isn't emotionally appropriate as well. So it's just this idea of you have lots of affective effects, basically. So you would, in describing this in a question, you might say, more easy to anger or more irritable, like generally in a bad mood, hard to control emotions. You can just describe things like that. Because they may ask you, what are two effective effects? Anything of another word than effects, but two effective consequences of partial sleep deprivation. And then you could say something like, yeah, more easily irritable and trouble judging other people's emotions, something like that. Okay, so in terms of behavior, and again, as I say this, it's very important to know which ones are effective, which are behavioral, which are cognitive, because VCA can very easily ask you what are some cognitive effects of partial sleep deprivation. And if you're not reading the question properly, you might talk about, feelings of grogginess, easy to anger, moody. And it's that idea that you're listing off, your A's and your B's, but you haven't read the question specifically enough and like to realize that they're just asking you about cognitive. So it's important that which sort of symptoms or which effects fit into which category, but also that you're reading the question so you're able to figure out, is VCA asking me for any effects, or are they asking me specifically for behavioral ones, for example? Okay, so sleep inertia is basically if you're in like year 10 physics or whatever, when you talk about inertia, it's that idea of well, you can tell I haven't done physics in a while, like when your body is being still and whatever, the idea that you're when the bus stops and then you move, that idea, inertia, right? So if you just apply that sort of idea to sleep, you can kind of comprehend what it's saying. Like when you wake up from sleep but you sort of internally still feel like you're sleeping, that sort of idea. So you're very groggy, your brain basically hasn't switched on. And often when I talked about, when you wake up naturally, you kind of exit out of REM sleep. If you wake up with an alarm or you wake up, a little bit earlier than your sleep cycle is completed, you might wake up in the middle of your deep sleep, your NREM 3 and 4, and this sort of effective sleep inertia is likely to be a bit more prominent because of this idea that you're in that sort of stage of deep sleep. So feelings of grogginess, slower reaction time, reduced alertness, those are the things that you're wanting to think of there. So excessive sleepiness, I wouldn't write like sleepiness as an effect. I would say things like, slower reaction time, decreased alertness, decreased coordination, making more mistakes, stuff like that. Impaired concentration is a little bit more cognitive. I'd say behavioral is sometimes the most tricky one to like make sure that you're thinking of behavioral ones for. I remember my teacher saying this to me, like, I think our textbook or something listed a behavioral effect as like fatigue or like being tired. Depends on your teacher, depends on the examiner, I guess, but that's pretty wishy-washy in my opinion. Like saying like, what's an effective sleep deprivation? Being tired? Like I guess so, but I think I would steer clear of that if you can, and say things like, slower reaction time, decreased alertness, making more mistakes, decreased coordination, that sort of thing. Even like slower movements, maybe. Slow reaction time is probably better. But yeah, just think about things to do with behavior. Often in my head, I just like to think of things that involve like moving. Because yeah, otherwise sometimes I might lean towards like cognitive stuff, like impaired concentration. That's a bit more cognitive in my opinion. Okay, so cognitive functioning, this should kind of be a bit easier to rattle off. So problem solving, your decision making, your memory, your attention, your concentration, all that sort of stuff. As you can imagine, again, as I'm sure you've all experienced, when you've had a bad night's sleep, you just don't really focus that well and everything's a little bit, yeah. So that's what you can kind of think of there. Something to be aware of, again, a little bit more of an FYI, but it's just a bit of a thing that you don't generally think of. You think, like intuitively, you think it would be the other way around, that people who are sleep deprived, they tend to actually do quite well on their simple repetitive tasks. Sorry, no, that's the wrong thing. See, literally, I still get confused about it. They do quite poorly on the simple repetitive tasks, but they do relatively well on your complex tasks. And I think it's this idea that when you're doing a complex task, you really have to focus, or put in a lot of energy. And when you're sleep deprived, like you can still like, harness all your energy into this one activity. Whereas with your simple repetitive tasks, because it's simple, your body just goes into sort of autopilot mode. But because it's so simple and it just requires a little bit, like just doing things automatically, because your body is in such a state when it's sleep deprived of not doing things well, the simple things that you don't have to use much brain power for are actually done pretty poorly. Whereas, yeah, if you've got a complex task, you can kind of just go, oh, okay, I need to actually put any energy that I've got left into this. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. It's just a little bit of a, ironic sort of thing. Okay, this is a very nice table. I would memorize at least 3 of each for your exam. So 3 affective, 3 behavioral, 3 cognitive. Again, fatigue is listed in the behavior table. I don't really like it. I choose something else. Reduced motor coordination, micro sleeps, reduced reaction time. Maybe those are 3 I'd go for. Impaired behavior control, maybe. With your affective, again, there's a lot of stuff with emotion. So easily irritated, amplified emotional responses, difficulty judging others' emotions. Those are probably some good ones. And then cognitive, they're all pretty good. So memory, inability to focus, poor decision making, problem solving, that sort of thing. But make sure you are able to put them into their categories. Very important. You could even get a multiple choice thing that's talking about so-and-so had a really bad night's sleep. At work, they keep on, I don't know. At school, they keep on dozing off in class or paying attention out the window. What is this an example of? It would be cognitive, that idea of not being able to maintain focus or attention. Okay, so looking at this study of sleep deprivation versus blood alcohol concentration, basically the idea here is you had a study. Condition 1, you're kept awake, so sleep deprivation. Condition 2 is increasing the blood alcohol concentration. And then you're testing basically how well they can do cognitively in these little hand-eye coordination tests. So you can kind of see the effects of sleep deprivation in that way. So the idea of these key findings, and you have to know these numbers, the equivalent of a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05 was equal to 17 hours of sleep deprivation. 24 hours of sleep deprivation, so i.e. like a whole day, was equal to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1, which is obviously double the limit. The idea here is to emphasize this idea that when you think about how alcohol can influence someone who's driving, let's say, it's pretty bad, right? Like if you think about, this person has a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1. If they said, okay, should I go get in the car and drive now? You would say, no, that's foolish. You could kill someone, right? Whereas if someone has been sleep deprived for a while, if they said, okay, I'm going to get in the car now, you'd probably say, okay, or like if you think about it yourself, like if you're out and you have, a couple of drinks, you might say, okay, I'm not going to get in the car because it's quite dangerous, right? But if you, have to drive to work, and and you are quite sleep deprived from the past week, generally you won't think like, oh, I'm really tired, I'm not going to drive. But the idea with this is that being sleep deprived can be as bad as having, your blood alcohol concentration at the highest limit, or even worse. So it's this idea of understanding just how badly sleep deprivation can actually impact you in terms of your cognitive and your behavioral sort of functioning. So yeah, it's just an important thing to be able to understand these numbers. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit faster through with time, but circadian phase disorders, basically you're falling asleep too late or you're falling asleep too early. The idea here is that your circadian rhythm is not matching up to what you want it to be, basically. So we think about our DSPS, so our delayed sleep phase syndrome, or our ASPD, so our advanced sleep phase disorder. In the study design, these are abbreviated. So when you answer, oh my goodness, short answer questions on these, just feel to chuck in. Oh my gosh, feel free to chuck in DSPS and ASPD. Okay, so with DSPS, so your delayed sleep phase syndrome, these should be quite intuitive because they're very much in the name, comparing delayed to advanced. So delayed, your sleep phase is delayed. That means that you're going to bed later. You feel tired later. You want to wake up later. So this is kind of a common thing that can happen sometimes in adolescence. Your adolescents basically go to sleep a little bit later than everybody else because their melatonin is secreted a little bit later, just naturally, which is why sometimes adolescents can feel really sleep deprived when they have to wake up early for school, and why they tend to go to bed later, because of that idea that they simply don't feel tired earlier on in the night. So delayed, your sleep, you aren't feeling sleepy when you want to, you're feeling sleepy, oh my gosh, you're feeling sleepy a little bit later. Your melatonin is being secreted later, so that's why you're feeling drowsier only later. So again, this can be quite bad in terms of sleep deprivation, because if we think about, society, we start the day relatively early. So you often have to wake up early for school or for work. So if you have DSPS, you're wanting to go to bed later and your body is wanting to wake up later. So it's not that your body wants less amount of sleep. Your body still wants the same amount of sleep. It just wants to go to bed a little bit later. But obviously if you've got to wake up for school or work, instead of going to bed at 10 p.m. and waking up at 6, your body wants to go to bed at 1 a.m., but you still have to wake up at 6. So now you're getting 5 hours of sleep. And obviously that continues on. You're going to be feeling quite sleep deprived, and all those ABCs that we talked about come into effect. So your ASPD, again, advanced, it's being moved earlier. So you're feeling tired earlier in the night and you're wanting to wake up earlier in the morning. So this means that your melatonin is being secreted earlier. So you're feeling drowsy earlier. You're wanting to go to bed earlier. So this can obviously as well lead to sleep deprivation, but to less of an extent than DSPS. You don't really see it as much. And I think it's a bit more rare as well, this condition. But yeah, if you think about kind of going to sleep earlier doesn't have as much, I suppose, ramifications in terms of, if you want to wake up later in the day for school and for work, you have to get up early. Whereas if you want to fall asleep kind of early in the evening, your dinner plans might be cancelled, but it's not too bad of an issue in terms of like thinking about school and work. So in terms of sleep deprivation, you can kind of go to bed early and wake up early and it's not too much of an issue, whereas waking up later can be an issue. Okay, so fixing your circadian phase disorders, you use bright light therapy. Remembering this idea that with your ASPD and your DSPS, your melatonin is basically being secreted later or earlier, and remembering that light is kind of working on that SCN, which is working on that pineal gland, which is working on the melatonin. By influencing the amount of light that our body is being exposed to, we can influence that secretion of melatonin. So we generally do it through a light box. It's just what it sounds like, a box that emits a lot of light. You have to use it at the specific time of day, obviously, and you have to use it at the right intensity and for the right amount of time. Obviously, too much, too little light, not really good for you either. So with ASPD, we're falling asleep too early. Our melatonin is being secreted earlier. We want to secrete our melatonin later. We're going to shine the light later in the day. So let's say that I want to go to sleep at 6 p.m. and I want to wake up at 1 a.m., let's say, maybe. Oh, yeah. Okay. Or 2 a.m. or something like that. So obviously quite advanced. What I'll do is maybe at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., I will shine this light using this light box. And that will tell my brain, do not secrete melatonin, do not secrete it. And therefore my brain will secrete it later, and I'm going to be feeling drowsy later, and maybe I'll want to go to bed a little bit later. The other way, so DSPS, you want to secrete melatonin earlier in the day. You want to bring that circadian rhythm earlier, move it a little bit earlier. So what you're going to do is you're going to shine that light box really early in the day, and then that's going to, tell the brain like, okay, I'm awake nice and early in the morning, and then it's going to time nicely, and it'll secrete that melatonin a little bit earlier in the day. So that means that you're waking up in the morning, you're feeling alert in the morning. So then by the time night comes, you're feeling tired, your melatonin is being secreted, and that's getting sort of shifted back. Hopefully that is kind of all clear. Okay, sleep hygiene is basically just kind of strengthening cues for sleep. So having a really regular routine. Obviously, if you're sleeping at random times of the day, sleeping at different times every night, your body's getting a bit confused. That circadian rhythm over a 24-hour period, it's suddenly being thrown out. So not engaging in energizing activities before bed, so not using your phone before bed. Also strengthening the cues in your bedroom for sleeping. So not studying in your bedroom, or in your bed, not, again, going on your phone in your bed, not even reading in your bed, because it's this idea that your body thinks, your body kind of associates your bedroom with activity, with mental activity. And as well, if you do energizing activities before bed, like we've said, exercising is important, but that's during the day, doing regular exercise during the day. So again, you feel tired at night, but not exercising right before bed, because then obviously that's going to send your energy levels a little bit higher and all that sort of stuff. So it's just this idea of basically getting into a good routine, helping the body feel tired, and also strengthening the cues in the bedroom for sleep, basically. Okay, so these are those little zeitgebers that we talked about. So if you are struggling to sleep, it's this idea of using these cues to your advantage. So we've talked about light a little bit. We generally think about daylight, right? How that influences your sleep schedule. But blue light, I'm sure you guys are very familiar with this, coming from your phones, your tablets, when you're using them in your bed when you're using them at night before bed, your brain is basically saying, okay, this is blue light, and it's telling the SCN, and then it's saying, okay, don't secrete melatonin, because it thinks that it's daytime. Because blue light and daylight, they work the same way in the brain. And the brain just says, okay, it's light. I can see light is shining into the eyes. Obviously, it's not time to go to sleep because it's daylight. And so that can obviously delay the melatonin secretion, and then you feel less drowsy, and then you go to bed a little bit later, which is why it's such a thing to be like, oh, don't use phones before bed, especially if you're struggling to sleep. Temperature. So the idea is that you have a bit of a drop in temperature as you go to sleep. So therefore kind of matching that maybe a bit more helpful. So maybe not having, too high of a temperature, obviously not having it freezing as well, but just kind of accommodating, for the body to have that drop in temperature a little bit. And eating and drinking as well. So eating and drinking a lot right before bed, not really the best thing, because again, thinking about meal times, you get a big burst of energy after you eat a meal. And so having that big burst of energy, the body thinks, okay, I'm preparing, to stay awake for a long time after, and having a lot of this energy before bed isn't really what you are aiming for. Okay, part 2. So I'm going to cycle through this a little bit quicker. I think mental well-being, the stuff is probably a little bit easier to grasp, but yeah, just due to time, we'll kind of move through it so we get to research methods as well. Again, any questions that you have on that, feel free to pop it through in the live chat, and then again, you will get a copy of these slides as well. Okay, so obviously we are going to be talking about mental well-being, we're going to be talking about mental health, that sort of thing. If there's anything here that you think isn't the best thing to listen about, of course that's completely fine, and also feel free to use any of these resources. It's really important to be looking after yourself. I know this, might sound a little bit cliche, but year 12 is obviously, assuming most of you are in year 12, you may be in year 11 as well. But it can be really quite stressful. Again, we're getting to the middle of the year. Next semester, term 3 for me was the hardest term. I found it to be, because obviously it's before exam time, you've got all your sacs going on, and you might be cramming a little bit. It can get really stressful. And also something for me that I found to be a cause of stress was that I felt really sort of demotivated. I didn't have like the energy I had in Sem 1. And that can kind of put you into a little bit of an academic slump almost. So just be mindful of that, and also make sure you are not overworking yourself. You don't want to burn out, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, just be really aware and kind of check in with yourself, especially when you learn about this sort of thing as well. It's really, really important to make sure that you are asking for help if you need it, basically. Okay, so with our mental well-being or mental health, we look at it on a continuum. So kind of like what I was talking about before with consciousness. It's not a, mentally healthy and then you step down and then mental health problem and then step down and then mental health disorder. It's this idea that you can sit in a continuum, and in this aspect of being mentally healthy, you can sit right up here or you could sit right down here. There's still a lot of leeway within what is categorized as mentally healthy. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. And obviously, you can move up and down the continuum at different times depending on what's going on in one's life. So this idea of kind of a definition of mentally healthy, obviously it's hard to put a definition to this kind of thing. But a generally positive state, this doesn't mean, the world is all rainbows and sunshine and all that all the time. You're not so happy all the time. But generally being in a positive state, not being in a pessimistic state all the time. But again, I just want to flag, it's not this idea of whatever comes your way, you're smiling, you're always positive about. It means as well, you have proper emotional regulation. You're able to understand when an event should make you sad or should make you upset, but also this idea of being able to bounce back and those sorts of things. So on that idea of bouncing back, coping with challenges, working productively, forming relationships with others, that sort of thing. So obviously we can kind of, again, slip up and down this continuum. So this idea of a mental health problem, it may be a brief sort of short thing. And once things get a little bit more serious, it may be a diagnosable mental health disorder. So this is obviously when you would be diagnosed. So it's, to do with seeing a psychiatrist and things like that. It's not just do I kind of feel this way? Do I kind of feel, it's something a little bit more chronic, it happens over a long period of time, and you have to fulfill certain criteria according to the DSM, sort of like the handbook of mental health disorders, that sort of thing. Okay, so things that affect where we sort of sit on this continuum, things that affect our mental well-being, are our internal and our external factors. So internal means that they originate within ourselves. So, our genetic makeup, our feelings, our beliefs, that sort of thing. And obviously that can dictate where you're sitting on that continuum. So if you, have certain thoughts, if you've got certain feelings, you may be right up the mentally healthy, you may be a little bit lower down, you may be a little bit more stressed, that sort of thing. And external factors, anything that originate outside the individual. So your relationships with someone, life events, cultural influences as well. They can all influence your mental well-being. So hopefully that makes sense. In terms of some important definitions to know, these kind of sit, sometimes on their own little continuum as well. Phobia is really important, and we'll get into it in a second. But you need to understand the distinction between stress, anxiety, and phobia. So we've talked a bit about stress in Unit 3. So you guys should be, experts on this sort of thing. But with your definition of stress, it's more of this kind of goes from like more appropriate to sort of more inappropriate. So stress is a very normal emotion, obviously. Very common, you can experience it due to a lot of different reasons. And it can be, good and bad. But if you experience stress, you may slip down that continuum a little bit, but it doesn't, it might not mean that you're, extremely stressed out all the time and, you're extremely anxious all the time. It just means that, something is causing a period of stress. Anxiety is separated from stress in this idea that it's always sort of negative and we're always thinking about something going wrong in the future. So stress, often we think about stress being negative. Obviously, sometimes it can be positive as well. But when you think about, this sort of negative source of stress or negative feelings towards stress, it can be, something from the past. It can be something from, the present, something from the future. Anxiety is very similar to stress, but it's this idea of always thinking about something that's going wrong in the future and these feelings that, something is about to go wrong, this sort of apprehension, that sort of thing. Phobia is much sort of further down this continuum. Again, it's a diagnosable condition. So again, thinking of a psychiatrist or a psychologist would diagnose a phobia. It's not, like sometimes you can obviously say, okay, yes, I'm stressed. Okay, yes, I feel quite anxious. A phobia, so this idea of having an excessive fear of something, that's something that's diagnosed. So the idea with the phobia is, of course, you've got an excessive fear of something, but particularly this idea that it's out of proportion to what it's kind of reasonable to be fearful of. So if you've got a fear of sharks, kind of valid, like they might bite you or something like that, or like a fear of flying, as in like, you might be a little bit afraid of flying and that idea that sure, something can go wrong, or a fear of heights. But if it's a phobia, it's this idea that you maybe never go to the beach, or you never want to even look at sand because of this idea that you fear that, in this body of water, there may be a shark. So this idea that it's a bit out of proportion. Or, if you don't want to go on a plane, sure, but maybe this idea that maybe you don't want to look at like pictures of planes or something like that, or you don't want to drop your friend at the airport, something like that. This idea that the threat caused by this certain stimulus, this certain event, is out of proportion to the fear. Okay, so in terms of ways that we consider mental well-being, this idea of a high level of functioning. So functioning, it's a very general term. It's basically just this idea that the person is kind of functioning well and able to meet the demands of sort of life almost. So some of these things that we think about, so you're productive at school, you're productive at work, your relationships with your family and friends are, it doesn't have to be going well, but this idea that you can form them well, this sort of thing. You've got your everyday living skills, as in just like independently taking care of yourself. Reasonable cognitive skills in that you can make reasonable decisions, judgments, that sort of thing, and reasonable emotional control. So you can see how these sort of things would comprise a high level of functioning, and that if you had to have some of these be a little bit poorer, like maybe you're not forming any relationships at all, are always having bad relationships with other people, maybe you're not very productive at work, maybe you're kind of struggling with everyday basic living skills, that may be, what you would call like a lower level of functioning, and that can obviously impact your mental well-being. So resilience, this is a really important one as well. This idea of being able to bounce back from certain challenges, being able to overcome challenges and kind of adapt and keep going ultimately. So a higher level of resilience obviously associated with sort of a higher level of mental well-being, because of this idea of when challenges arise, they can be perceived in a bit more of an perhaps optimistic way, or the idea is that one can perceive that I'm going to overcome this hurdle, as opposed to if this challenge comes up and it sort of is the end of the world, that sort of thing, kind of that poor resilience. You can see how those two different perspectives would lead someone to have, a higher mental well-being or a poorer mental well-being. So we kind of tie in often, like if you are displaying a bit more resilience, to have high self-efficacy, high self-esteem. So this sort of thing of just sort of a bit more trust or confidence in one's abilities to overcome a specific task. So in saying this, you're not born with high resilience or low resilience. You may be more inclined for something, but it changes throughout life. It changes based on, the life events, the people that you're surrounded with, your attitudes, your beliefs at the time, those sort of things. But high resilience, just like high levels of functioning associated with kind of a stronger or higher mental well-being. Okay, so we're looking at this framework. So social and emotional well-being, it's also known as SEWB. So that's abbreviated on the study design as well. So this is a specific framework that's used particularly by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And it's this idea of considering the connections across different domains and how they impact one's mental well-being, again, tying in specifically to social and emotional sort of health. So the different things that are looked at here, so these are specific things that you need to be aware of. So looking at the body, mind, family, community, culture, land, and spirituality. So you can see that it's, of vastly different things, and it's how these all sort of come together and how they can influence one's mental well-being, and how your well-being in each of these categories can kind of, increase and decrease, and how they all contribute to this overall idea. And in saying that, of course, that they can fluctuate as well. So when you're thinking about body, you're thinking about physical health, mind, mental health, and so on. But these are all, they're all sort of respective domains within themselves, but it's important to understand that they all interact, and you're thinking of this forming and shaping one's well-being at that present time. Okay, so the biopsychosocial model, really important to understand. Biopsychosocial, the idea that they integrate. This is a diagram that you'll see everywhere in terms of this little Venn diagram. It's really important to understand this part here, how they all interact, how these two interact, these two, and these two. Baker always emphasizes the idea that they all interact equally. So it's not that social is more important than biological, which is more important than psychological. They all interact to influence somebody's mental well-being at the time. So it's important to understand the different categories. What we look at these sort of in the context of is specific phobia and also the maintenance of mental well-being. You need to know which ones are biological, what's psychological, and what is social. Okay, so again, we've got this idea here of specific phobia. It's what we were talking about in that definition before. And we're looking at these sorts of risk factors, or these contributing factors, but also their interventions. So firstly, we're going to look at the biological contributing factors. Again, very, very important to understand what's biological, what's psychological, and what's social. So with your biological, we've got GABA dysfunction. So we talked about GABA, or you would have talked about GABA in Unit 3. So GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So we think about the role being to kind of calm down your neurons. So if you have GABA dysfunction, and what we're thinking about when we say dysfunction is your lower levels of GABA, that can lead to anxiety and this idea of a more anxious response, because you've got less of this inhibitory neurotransmitter. It means your neural pathways are firing more frequently than they should. And this can lead to overactivity of the neurons, and then therefore sort of this anxious response. So that's what we're thinking about there. You need to have high levels, not high levels, but high enough levels of GABA so that it can kind of work with glutamate and sort of calm down these responses and inhibit these pathways. But if you don't have that, it just causes overactivity of the neurons ultimately. So again, something you've seen in Unit 3. While I'm saying this, I hope this is a good example of how the study design is very intertwined and how it crosses over. I think I'll talk about this when I get to exam strategies, but I cannot emphasize enough how important the study design is to know and to be aware of what the different areas of study are, and importantly, how they can all intertwine. Okay, so long-term potentiation, again, is something you saw in the area of study 1, I want to say. Anyway, Unit 3. And what that is, it's the strengthening of synaptic connections. So if we think about specific phobia, strengthening of synaptic connections, you're basically strengthening the association between fear and this certain stimulus. So for example, a spider, if you've got arachnophobia, you in your brain, you've got fear and you've got spiders, and long-term potentiation is making an extremely strong, or multiple strong pathways that connect these two. And every time you think of these pathways are being fired, and it's just getting strengthened and strengthened. And that's basically consolidating that fear. So that's what we can kind of see there. And that idea that the more the connection is used, the more it will be strengthened. So the more you think about your stimulus and the more you think about it in this sort of context, basically the worse the fear gets. Okay, so those are your two biological ones. For psychological, we're thinking of our behavioral models. So we're thinking of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So your classical conditioning, this is when we're thinking about the acquisition of phobia. So if you see in pink, we've got precipitation by classical conditioning, and the other one is perpetuation by operant conditioning. So if you think about the words precipitation and perpetuation, precipitation, I think of rain, like it's called precipitation, that's what I always think of. It's like the initial almost like triggering of this acquisition, I guess development of this phobia. And then perpetuation is like the maintenance, so maintaining this phobia. So with classical conditioning, we're thinking of this precipitation because it's this initial association that's formed between fear and the stimulus. So Little Albert is this really famous experiment. It used to be on the study design. I'm sure a lot of your teachers will still use it as an example, but if you haven't heard of it, it is ultimately this picture that we see on the left with our neutral stimulus was our rat, and our unconditioned stimulus was ultimately fear. Or I suppose our response was fear, but this idea of something that caused fear. So they would, in front of little Albert, it was like a very unethical experiment and all that, but they would present the rat in front of him and then strike this really loud sort of metal plank or whatever with a hammer. So obviously little Albert would cry in response to that really loud noise. And so we're building this association, I'm assuming that you guys are still very comfortable or all on top of classical conditioning. In saying that as well, make sure over this term that you are revising everything from Unit 3. Really, really important. But yeah, we're building this association. So we're using multiple pairings in this situation. However, when we think about precipitation by classical conditioning, because it's almost so traumatic, you don't really need multiple pairings. Just one sort of pairing is enough. But anyway, in this sort of little Albert situation, they did it multiple times. And then little Albert was left with this fear of white rats and fear of, he showed stimulus generalization. So this idea of fear of anything that sort of looked like white and fluffy, basically. So yeah, very unethical, but very famous experiment. So that's what you can kind of think about in terms of precipitation. They basically used classical conditioning to, give little Albert a specific phobia. So you can kind of think about, the main thing you want to think about here is just the association. Okay, so in your perpetuation by operant conditioning, so now we've got this phobia. We basically maintain this phobia due to negative reinforcement through avoidance behavior. So this is really, really important to know this in this context, negative reinforcement. So again, I'm assuming you guys are still familiar with your stuff on operant conditioning. Any questions you get on operant conditioning and specific phobia, use the term negative reinforcement. It's really important. In terms of this negative reinforcement, we're avoiding the stimulus. So if you've got a fear of spiders, or the fear of dogs, so you've got a fear of dogs, by avoiding these dogs, you are not experiencing fear. And that's negative reinforcement because you're taking, if you remember the definition of negative reinforcement, you're taking away something undesirable and that's going to reinforce that behavior and make it more likely to occur. So if someone says, hey, let's go to the dog park, and you say, no way, I'm not going to the dog park, you're basically being negatively reinforced to not go to the dog park because you are not feeling those feelings of fear and anxiety and all of that sort of stuff. So that's why it's this idea of avoidance behavior. So if you're walking and you see a dog and then you run the other direction and go the long way, those feelings of fear are alleviated. So next time you see a dog, you're more likely to do the same thing. Hopefully that makes sense. But it's this idea of reinforcement. You're reinforcing something, so you're making it more likely to occur. And it's negative because you're taking away these feelings of fear. But the idea of why this is being perpetuated is because you're more likely to do these behaviors again and again. And so every time you see a dog, you go the long way around, you run away. So you feel good, right? Because you're not being scared. But this is obviously perpetuating that specific phobia, and that's making the specific phobia worse. Okay. So our other psychological contributing factors are our cognitive biases. So Vika wants you to think of two specific ones. So catastrophic thinking and memory bias, very much in the name. With psych, this is like a bit of a tip. Everything is really in, not everything, but 90% of things are really in the name. So if you try and think about something by understanding what the name is actually saying, that can kind of help you and can save you time instead of rote learning things. Just think like, what is catastrophic thinking, memory bias, and sort of link that, rather than like catastrophic thinking is this thing, but not actually understanding the term catastrophic thinking. Hopefully that made sense. I feel like that was a really bad way of explaining it. But okay, so catastrophic thinking, what it is thinking that everything is going to be a catastrophe. So thinking that being exposed to your feared stimulus, the worst thing is going to happen. So if you've got a fear of a dog, right? Catastrophic thinking is, oh my gosh, I see a dog. This dog is going to come up to me. It's going to eat me. It's going to like rip my nose off. It's going to kill me. It's going to do all of this stuff. So that's probably very unlikely, right? Like the dog will probably come up to you, maybe lick you or something like that. But it's this idea that you're always thinking of the worst possible outcome. And obviously, if you think an animal is going to kill you, it's very valid for you to not want to go near it. But it's the way that thinking will, again, perpetuate this phobia. Memory bias is basically just remembering all the negative experiences you've had with this stimulus as opposed to the positive. So if you, again, are fearful of dogs, memory bias is this idea that you're going to remember the 2 times that you've had bad experiences with dogs, but you're not going to remember the 13 times before that when you had good experiences with dogs. That's the idea of memory bias. Okay, and then lastly, moving on to our social contributing factors. So you've got your specific environmental trigger. This is basically just one really traumatic experience, and this sort of causes the phobia. That's really what it is. So if you've got a fear of dogs, maybe your neighbor's dog running up to you and biting you when you were 4 or something like that. It's that specific environmental trigger. And people with phobias often recognize this as the start of their phobia. Yes. Okay. So stigma around seeking treatment. Again, this can perpetuate a phobia once it's been established because of this idea that people are fearful to seek treatment, sometimes because they're fearful to admit that they have a phobia. They fear that they may be ridiculed, they may be teased by their friends and family. They fear, people might not understand it. If you tell someone, oh, I've got a really big fear of butterflies, as, someone without a phobia, you may think, oh, that's so silly, like a butterfly could never hurt you, all these sorts of things. And that, if you express that to the person, you can see why that would make them a little bit less likely to seek treatment or a little bit less likely to feel comfortable telling someone else about it because they feel, oh, I'm so silly. Nobody will understand. I just don't want to talk about it. And that will obviously continue that specific phobia. Okay. So that is for your contributing factors. So remember, categorize them between your bio, your psycho, and your social. Now we're moving on to interventions. What's sort of nice with specific phobia is that not your biological, all of your contributing factors sort of have like a complementary intervention. So one of our contributing factors was GABA dysfunction. One of our interventions is benzodiazepines, which basically fix the GABA dysfunction. So it kind of saves you brain space. Like if you just remember one, you can kind of remember the other. Like if you remember, okay, GABA dysfunction is a biological contributing factor. How should I fix that? Oh, benzodiazepines. Okay, then that's the intervention. Hopefully that makes sense. Like you can kind of think of them as pairs rather than here's 6 contributing factors I have to remember, here's 6 interventions. You can just think here's 6 pairs of things that I have to remember. Okay, so as I mentioned, benzodiazepines, they are just a drug basically that mimics GABA. So again, that kind of fixes that issue of having low levels of GABA. It increases GABA's inhibitory effects, and then you have less of that overactivity of the neurons. That's ultimately what we've got going on there. Breathing retraining. So this is, again, it's in a biological intervention because it's a very sort of physiological thing. So when you're exposed to your phobic stimulus, you can often hyperventilate, overbreathe. Obviously, you get into a bit of a panic. Your fight flight kicks in, or fight flight freeze kicks in. And so obviously, with the actual physiological symptom of overbreathing, you can lead to dizziness, lightheadedness, blurred vision because of this reduced oxygen intake and reduced carbon dioxide output, I suppose. And then again, that can cause a whole thing, another panic as well. So learning to not overbreathe and kind of learning these breathing techniques can be really helpful in the situation that you've or in the circumstance that you are exposed to your phobic stimulus and you feel that sort of panic coming in. So obviously it's like a proper thing, but generally thinking of slow, deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. Often, the deep breaths that you think about when you do like mindfulness or meditation, that sort of thing. So that can be really helpful because it can obviously reduce the things that we just discussed. But importantly, also having this feeling of, calm, relaxation, and therefore not having those feelings of anxiety, that fight, flight, freeze sort of kicking in there. Okay, so moving on to our psychological interventions, we have CBT. So CBT is this sort of big psychological thing. So it's stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's this sort of all-encompassing therapy that involves sort of replacing negative or harmful thoughts with good ones and replacing negative and harmful behaviors with good ones as well. So if we think about the cognitive part of CBT in the context of specific phobia, it's just challenging all of these sort of thinking bad sort of thoughts that we have. So if you think about, for example, our cognitive biases, our catastrophic thinking, our memory bias, the cognitive component can kind of work to sort of fix these. So gathering facts about the phobic stimulus, understanding, why are you afraid of spiders? Like, what's the actual reality of spiders, causing you harm and this and that. And it really works to, the emphasis here is change and replacing. So you're wanting to replace these really harmful thoughts or negative thoughts or irrational thoughts with more logical ones, basically. Your behavioral component is your sort of operant conditioning and that sort of stuff. So you're reducing your avoidance behaviors. You might be implementing those relaxation techniques, exercise, that sort of thing. The breathing retraining that we just talked about. That's kind of going on to your behavior. So you can see how that kind of works with your operant conditioning contributing factor, limiting those avoidance behaviors. Another really important one is your systematic desensitization. So again, the word may sound foreign, but just think about it. Systematic desensitization. So systematic, you're going through sort of this progression and you're desensitizing yourself to this phobic stimulus. So we've got this sort of graduated exposure going on. And again, the flavor of the month here, the word is this idea of replacing, changing something. So we're replacing these feelings of anxiety with feelings of relaxation, ultimately. So the way to do this is a 3-step process. The first one is to teach the individual a relaxation technique. So often we think about that being breathing retraining, so what we've just discussed. So we teach them, how to breathe properly and all that sort of stuff. Then we have the individual create a fear hierarchy. This is where your systematic or your graduated part is going to come in. So if you're afraid of spiders, we're creating a hierarchy from least feared to most feared. So it might be hearing the word spider and then looking at a drawing of a spider, looking at a picture of a spider, looking at a video of a spider, looking at a spider in front of you far away, looking at a spider close up, having a spider on you. Maybe that's the fear hierarchy, right? And then what you do is you basically combine step 1 and step 2. So you gradually work through that hierarchy, and at each step you are using this relaxation technique to basically eliminate this fear. So it's really important in the way that it's graduated. So you're not getting this hierarchy and like running through them and going, okay, photo of a spider, breathe, video of a spider, breathe. It's this idea of you're getting, them to the step that they least fear. And then you're really using this technique properly until that person feels comfortable to move on to the next one. It would be completely useless if you were to get to, the photo, and then they're already feeling still panicked, and then you go, okay, let's go to the next one, the next one, the next one, because that's not going to work, because they still feel fearful at even looking at a photo. They're not going to do well at having the spider on their hand. So it's this idea of they move through each step only when they're 100% comfortable and no longer fearful of this sort of specific situation. And so by the end, when they're able to have that spider on them, it's this idea of that fear really, really being reduced. Okay, and then our social interventions. So we're thinking of psychoeducation for families and supporters. So this is obviously more so, the community, like external to the actual individual. VCAR wants you to know 2 specific things as part of this: challenging unrealistic or anxious thoughts and not encouraging avoidance behaviors. So it's almost really like identical to CBT, but it's like the family and friends just have to do it. So if an individual, expresses their thoughts maybe on this phobic stimulus, being able to challenge them and being able to help them see things a little bit more logically, and also not encouraging avoidance behaviors. So like I mentioned before, that scenario where you see a dog, you want to go the long way around the block. Maybe if your friend or family is with you, they can say, no, we're going to walk this pathway. You're going to walk here. So that avoidance behavior isn't reinforced. And again, that doesn't mean saying like, okay, I'm going to make you like touch this dog, and this dog, I'm going to release it from its lead. It's just saying don't actively avoid it. Don't engage in these avoidance behaviors. Okay, so that is it on specific phobia. In terms of our last little bit here, it's on protective factors. So these are basically the opposite of risk factors. So factors that protect one's mental well-being and can kind of push you towards that higher end of the continuum, basically. So we are thinking of adequate diet and adequate sleep. So I'm sure, honestly, this is probably like the easiest part of this area of study because it's very intuitive. So getting a variety of different foods, staying hydrated, enough, food intake, enough healthy foods, minerals, that sort of thing. That's what we're thinking about when you think of an adequate diet, a well-balanced diet, and also limiting, your junk foods, drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing, and keeping nutrition high. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff you can talk about here. Just keep it simple in your short answers. So literally just saying variety of different foods, hydrating, eating, the right amount, avoiding too much unhealthy food. Something like that. Like something like you don't have to be really super thorough and include everything under the sun on the food pyramid. Just, be concise with your answer. And then adequate sleep. So we've had this whole area of study on sleep. You'll be very, very good at this point. So just talking about sleep quality and quantity, talking about limiting, reason for sleep deprivation, that sort of stuff. Okay, so your psychological protective factors, basically the cognitive and behavioral part of CBT. So basically all of CBT. So just this idea of, again, replacing any irrational thoughts and harmful or illogical thoughts with more well thought out, considered, logical ones, basically. And the same with behaviors. Any behaviors that are detrimental to your well-being, replacing them with things that are a little bit more positive, basically. So obviously we talked about cognitive behavioral strategies in CBT in the context of specific phobia. In this context, you're describing it very generally. You're just describing it in mental well-being in general. So obviously when you write a response, it'll be different, compared to what you would talk about in the context of specific phobia. Okay, and then your other psychological protective factor is mindfulness meditation. So again, this kind of controlled breathing, controlling one's awareness, this idea of focusing on, one's thoughts, one's feelings, one's emotions, how one is at the present time. That can be really helpful for sort of centering oneself. And again, keeping aware of, am I getting, am I falling a little bit down that continuum? Am I feeling stressed, but maybe I'm just not acknowledging it? Sometimes focusing and being aware of your internal feelings through mindfulness meditation can be a good way to note things like that. Okay, and then lastly, your social protective factors. So your support from your family, friends, and community. So this can obviously be different types of support. It can be emotional support, financial support, informational support, whatever it is. But this idea that you have support in general, you feel that there are people that you can lean on, and they can be a source for positivity and all those good things. Yeah. So the idea here is that when you may be slipping down that continuum, it's sort of like a catch-22 almost. You probably feel a little bit less inclined to share it with someone. Sometimes you want to isolate yourself. You feel that you don't want to socialize. You might stop going to school, might stop going to work. So it's that idea of you're kind of maybe in the time where you need most help, but you're not sort of able to access it in that way, which is why support can be really, really helpful, especially in those sort of times. Okay, and then we have these cultural determinants of mental well-being. So again, thinking of this sort of relating to our social and emotional well-being in terms of that framework. So this idea of cultural continuity, again, how this impacts and how this sort of influences mental well-being is this idea of obviously kind of being a bit more of a protective factor. So this idea of continuing traditions, continuing aspects of one's culture, particularly in the history when we think about, stolen generations and things like that, and how, elements of culture have been sort of removed. So this idea of preserving these sorts of things is really helpful in terms of mental well-being and on a community level as well. So these are just some strategies. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more, but this idea of promoting more education, welcome to country ceremonies as well, therapy and support groups discussing these sorts of things. Really important in this idea of cultural continuity and preservation. And again, how that ties in with that SEWB. And then lastly, self-determination. So this idea of, again, having power, having resources to support one's own mental well-being. And again, tying this into the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So with this idea of smoking ceremonies, bush medicine, spiritual realignment, these sorts of traditional forms of healing that link to mental well-being in a way that is still very true to their culture and things like that. So that's that idea of self-determination there. Hopefully that is all making sense. Okay, so I know we have just a little bit of time left. I'm probably going to go through this relatively quickly. I know I said that about the last part as well, but research methods are so important. One thing I always tell my students is please do not neglect research methods. It's very easy to think, because it's like a lot of definition sort of stuff, and obviously you apply it to, sleep, or you apply it to mental well-being, or you apply it to stress. It's easy to think like, oh, I just need to, like when I need to know everything about stress and I'll be able to answer all experimental questions on it. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes, I'm sure you're aware, especially with the 10 marker, or I don't know, you may or may not be aware, but like the 10 marker, at least when I was in year 12, people always try to predict the 10 marker. And I remember we always thought that it would never be on research methods, because it hadn't been in the past on the study design. So everyone was always saying, it's never going to be on research methods. It's never going to be on research methods. And luckily for me, because I did psych in year 11, it wasn't on research methods. But I remember next year when all my friends were doing psych, that year it was on research methods, I'm pretty sure. So don't neglect it. And I think it's kind of seen as a little bit tricky, like to do questions on it. And maybe that's why students tend to avoid it as well. I mean, like I always used to leave the tricky things for last. But it's really, really important, and don't neglect it. Don't kind of like lull yourself into a false sense of security and thinking like, oh, I know what an independent variable is. I'll be able to answer the questions. Constantly stay revising this stuff. Okay. So hypotheses, really, really important. You have to mention the population. I think that's a bit of a difference between psych hypotheses and other ones. So here we're talking about Australian adults. If you don't mention Australian adults in this, or you just use the sample and not really the population, it's not the best hypothesis. So that's included in your little iPod acronym, population. That's really important. I think that's something that students tend to miss. So Australian adults who read at least one book per week will score higher on a standard IQ test than Australian adults who don't read at all. So the independent variable being the sort of amount of books that are being read. the population being Australian adults. Operationalizing something, to be fair, oh yeah, this hypothesis is kind of operationalized. It just means being specific. So rather than Australian adults who read more will be smarter than Australian adults who don't read, that isn't really operationalized because it doesn't tell you exactly how you're measuring the IV and the DV. So saying, at least one book per week will score higher on a standard IQ test. It tells you how you're going to measure stuff, basically. And then your dependent variable, so the thing that's being measured, so the score on the IQ test. So those are some important elements. Just practice writing your hypotheses, show them to your teacher, show them to your friends, show them to your tutor, whoever, and just make sure that you're really on top of it, because it's something super simple. But sometimes it can be hard to get it correct if you're constantly sort of doing the wrong thing. That sounds very obvious, but as in if you're constantly forgetting something, or if you think that you're meeting the criteria but you're not, is sort of what I'm trying to say there. Okay. So knowing the difference between your experimental group and your control group. So with psych, the participants, it's always like participants. It's not like bio or chem where you're working with plants or chemicals. You're working with people here. So that's why ethics is a bit more of a thing as well. So you often have you'll have your experimental group and your control group. So your experimental group are the people who are exposed to the IV. The control group are not. That's what we're thinking about. And the main overarching idea of like this whole chapter or this whole area of study on this idea of experimentation is that you are wanting to observe how the IV affects the DV. Everything you always talk about in this section relates to this. So your, placebo, your independent variables and your controlled variables, all that sort of stuff, it's all coming down to how am I setting up the experiment so that I can know for sure that the IV is affecting the DV in this way. Okay, so you've got your experimental design. So the three that you look at: independent groups, matched participants, repeated measures. So independent groups is the most common. You're in the control group or the experimental group, you're not crossing over. That's the one you'll end up seeing the most. The main drawback of this is that we've got individual participant differences. So if you're in two groups, you may have a lot of people that come from like one suburb or like a higher, socioeconomic status than the other group. And obviously that may affect the results. Matched participants, this sort of eliminates those participant differences because you pair individuals up. You might have people from all over Australia and maybe you pair them up based on their social economic status, or maybe you pair them up based on their IQ. So then you don't have to worry about, like for example, with this one, I don't know, maybe you might match them up on IQ or like education level or something like that. So that's not a variable that you have to be thinking about if you put them in independent groups. Lastly, repeated measures. In terms of participant differences, this is the best one because there are zero. Because if you're comparing your results when exposed to the IV to your results when exposed to the DV, there's no discrepancy on education level, SES, age, anything like that, because you're the same person. The only thing that is a big drawback of this is you have order effects. So order effects basically are when you get biased results or skewed results because individuals have had time to practice, essentially. So if you say, okay, do this task while you are on a lot of caffeine, and then do this task when you're not on a lot of caffeine, you're obviously comparing the effects of caffeine on hand-eye coordination, something like that. Say it's a driving test. The second time they do it, they have practiced, they've done it before. They may get a better result. And then that's not necessarily due to having caffeine or not having caffeine, but due to them just practicing. So for that reason, we bring in this thing called counterbalancing. So it means that if you've got 10 participants, instead of 10 of them doing the driving test with caffeine and then 10 of them doing it without caffeine, you've got 5 doing it with caffeine and 5 doing it with no caffeine first. And then you've got 5 doing it with no caffeine second, 5 doing it with caffeine second as well. So instead of them all doing one task first and all doing one task second, where in the second task they may all perform better than they typically would, if you counterbalance them, it cancels that out. Because you've had 5 people try the caffeine first, the driving with the caffeine first, and you've had 5 people try the driving without the caffeine, and then you swap them. So then on your result, or in your results, you shouldn't have any uneven skewing due to the order effect. I hope that makes sense. Just pop into chat if anything that I'm explaining is not making sense. But yeah. Okay, so your extraneous and confounding variables really important in psych. There can be a billion of them because, again, you're working with people. So an extraneous variable is anything that can influence the IV. That is not the DV, obviously. So you obviously do not want that. And then a confounding variable is basically the same thing, but it's that it's happened. So if something is confounding, it's basically just, it's completely confused you. You don't know if the IV has caused this or if the confounding variable has caused this. So your experiment is useless, basically. Yeah. Okay, so placebo is very common in psych as well. So if you're doing like a drug trial, if you give the experimental group the drug, the act of taking that drug is making them think like, okay, I'm taking something, I should be getting better, right? So that's the idea. Like if you give someone a sugar pill or something and you say it's Panadol, they'll say, oh, okay, my headache feels so much better now, because it's like psychosomatic, because they have this expectation that their headache should get better. So then they just believe that they're going to get better, if that makes sense. So the way that we control for those participant expectations is we give the control group a placebo. So I know this is like a bit weird. I want you to think about, it doesn't take away participant expectations. It just makes the experimental and the control group equal in that they both have this like sort of false idea that they're taking a pill, if that makes sense. So if you didn't have a placebo, so in your experimental group, you're giving them the drug. Your control group, you're not giving them anything. So the control group are just sitting there, not taking anything, and we're doing a drug trial. They're going to know, okay, I'm not being given any medication. And let's say it's for a cough or something, right? They're going to know, okay, I'm not getting any medication. I'm not expecting my cough to get better at all. In the experimental group, they're saying, okay, I'm getting a drug. I'm expecting my cough to get better. So it means that maybe the drug will improve their symptoms by 5 points. But that act of, oh, okay, I'm taking a drug, so I think I should be getting better, like that extra mental psychosomatic sort of thing, maybe that means that they rate their symptoms a 9. They said, okay, my symptoms improved by 9 points, when in reality, the drug has helped a bit, but like it's the idea that they're taking something that's kind of lulled them into this sort of false idea. So what you're doing by giving the control group a placebo is that you're sort of getting rid of that discrepancy there. And now both of these groups think that they're taking something, so they don't know like if they are or if they're not, if that makes sense. So the people in the control group, they're taking a pill, but then they're going, okay, like, this may be the sugar pill, it may not, whatever sort of effects that are psychosomatic. I don't even know if that's like a proper word to use, but whatever effects that are due to their expectations of taking a tablet, both groups are now experiencing that. So it's not an issue. And it just kind of cancels each other out, if that sort of makes sense. Okay. Lovely. So experimenter effect is basically if the experimenter knows what group they're in. So if the experimenter is going, okay, I know that you're in the control group, I know that you're in the experimental group, they may ask them slightly different questions, they may nudge them to answer things slightly differently. So you control for that by not telling the experimenter. Standardized instructions and procedures pretty straightforward. Again, it's just making sure that everything's on a level playing field and that no groups are being treated differently, basically. Okay, so we've talked about blinding the experimenter. So single blind is when just the participants don't know what group they're in. Double blind is when both the participants and the experimenter don't know. And so double blind is obviously the best option, because otherwise, again, participants, if they know what group they're in, they'll influence it. If the experimenter knows, they'll influence it as well. So sampling, so you can have random, stratified, or convenient. So random, it's just random. Stratified is based on the proportion. So instead of, 10 from each age group, you do it based on, there's a lot of 30-year-olds in here. So I'm going to take 60% of my group, make them 30-year-olds, and then the rest are divided. So it's that idea of stratifying them in accordance to their proportion in the population. Convenient sampling is literally, these people are around me, I'm just going to pick them. So even when you advertise based on a newspaper, like using a newspaper, that's convenient sampling because you're just getting participants who are kind of close to you. And not everybody in the population has an equal chance. So if you don't read that newspaper, if you don't go to that shop that sells the newspaper, you don't have a chance of being selected. And so that's why it's not random sampling. Okay, and so everything should also be randomly allocated. So once you get your sample, when, let's say you've got independent groups, you should randomly allocate people to your experimental group and your control group. Otherwise, again, you may get a not nice shuffle of different participant variables. Okay, so qualitative data, descriptive stuff, you're thinking about words. Quantitative, you're thinking about numerical data. You should know the mean. The mean is just the average. VCAR never really makes you calculate anything. Like here we have standard deviation because it's in the study design, but I don't even think I ever came across a question with standard deviation. But in saying that, you should know what it is. I don't want to say that and then it's like all over the exam. But yeah, mean and standard deviation are all you really have to know. Basically, the one on the left is what you want. The one on the right is what you don't want. If you've got a large standard deviation, it means that you had a lot of variance in your results. So some people, say this is like the cough thing. Some people said their cough improved by heaps. Some people said that their cough got worse. There's a lot of differences. Whereas here, like a lot of the people said that the cough was close to the mean. They all said it improved by around 3 to 4 points. That's obviously what you want because the results are similar. Okay, so reliability, basically the consistency of your experiment, so repeating it and getting the same results. Validity, in the context of psych, it's basically, is my experiment designed so that I'm actually getting the effect of the IV on the DV? So like validity, like this idea, if I stood on a scale, would it give me my true rate? Like that's true, like is something valid, but in the context of psych and our experiments, you think like, again, with this little cough drug experiment, although I guess that's not really very psychology-esque, but if you are saying, is my experiment valid? It's basically the way my experiment is designed, is it good enough of a test that it will show how this drug has kind of affected these symptoms ultimately? Okay, so then we've got generalization. So these are sort of what you come to with your conclusion. So it's basically, is my experiment designed well enough that I can say that the results that I found in this sample can be applied to the rest of the population. So the main thing here is that your sample should be representative of the population. So you shouldn't have used convenient sampling. You should have a big sample size, and then that means that your sample is representative of, the rest of the peers in the population. Also, of course, no ethical guidelines, and obviously no confounding or extraneous variables. If you meet all of those, basically if your experiment's like pretty good, you can sort of say, okay, this is what happened with 500 people in the population. I'm going to say that if I tested, all the 1,000 people in this population, I'd get pretty similar results. I'd say it's pretty accurate representation. That's the idea of making a generalization. This is a super important table. Remember it like the back of your hand. It's ways of fixing things in an experiment, ultimately. So again, order effects, the way that you fix that is by counterbalancing. If you want to get rid of participant expectations, you should use a placebo. If you have issues with convenient sampling, don't use convenient sampling, that sort of thing. Really, really important. You can expect questions on this in short answer, multiple choice as well. Okay, I'm going to zoom through these ethical principles. So protection security of participants' information, pretty straightforward, kind of ties in with confidentiality. Basically, if you're going to do an experiment, you're not expecting your results to be released everywhere and everybody that you know to have your information. Voluntary participation. You can't coerce someone into participating. They should be doing it willingly. At the same time, they should be able to leave when they want to. So none of this kind of like, I'll charge you money if you withdraw or anything like that. You should be able to join and leave as you please. Informed consent, super important, probably the most important, the one that gets tested the most. Participants should be aware of everything to do in the experiment, how it's going to be laid out, everything that they'll be involved in, everything that they have to do, and they obviously have to get written and express consent. If you use deception, you obviously wouldn't disclose that, but then you have to debrief them really properly at the end. And deception, you have to get permission for that first, and you have to make sure that there's no significant harm or anything like that, as a result of ultimately like lying to the participants. Yeah, that's basically that. Okay, we'll finish this off with some exam strategies. So before I go into these, I'm gonna try and think about what I was thinking about in the lecture so I don't forget them. But as I mentioned, the study design, really, really important, especially for the 10 marker is what I found. Because the 10 marker is so humongous, not to scare you or anything, but again, it's on a new study design. You would kind of expect the 10 marker to be similar, but I guess, kind of keep updated with what your teacher is telling you. Often it is around an area of study. So for example, like mine was on memory. And again, I'm saying this as part of the old study design, so take it with a grain of salt. But like mine was on memory. There were other ones that were on stress, other ones that were on sleep. So an area of study is quite a chunk of information. So it is important to, basically for me, like to know what's on the study design. When I wrote out my memory 10 marker in my exam, I basically thought of it according to the study design. And I remember at the end, at the end of my 10 marker, when I had kind of written everything, I just like added maybe like, a couple extra dot points because I remembered like, oh, I didn't talk about this specific dot point on the study design. Let me just write something here. And yeah, that was kind of that. So really know the study design. Use the study design for your studying. I honestly didn't really do this when I was in Psych 3-4, but I learned to do it in year 12 because of Psych 3-4. I used to do it just based on the chapters in my textbook, but the Psych textbook that I used was so like full of rubbish sometimes, like lots of unnecessary information. And I remember one time I wrote out like a whole case study. Like I think that was obviously my fault, not the textbooks, but yeah, going by chapter summaries, particularly in such a wordy subject like Psych, it wasn't as beneficial for me. So I would go by study design dot points. And through that, you know exactly what you need to be studying and not any irrelevant information that might be in your textbooks. And at the same time, you'll hopefully be memorizing or like getting a good idea of those dot points and those areas of study and what the main things are. And that can help you with what I've just discussed in terms of understanding the study design when you approach the exam. Like for example, there could be a question on your short answer and you might be really stuck. You might not know where you're going with it. But I always try to think to myself, like, what dot point on the study design are my VCAT examiners targeting right now with this question? And then I kind of like jog through the study design in my mind. And then I kind of go, oh, okay, must be this one. And that can kind of help get my kind of cogs turning a little bit if I'm unsure about what this question is trying to ask of me. Mind maps, I would say, are really good to link different areas of study. Videos, I didn't use videos for psych as much as I did for some of my other subjects. I think, because everything's a lot wordy, I'd say, and a bit less visual. But I think I did draw a couple of diagrams, like sometimes with your models of memory and your processes and stuff like that. Diagrams can be really helpful. Practice questions, as is written out in front of me. Very, 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 very important for every subject that you do. Obviously, like English and stuff, it's different if you're doing essay stuff. But for your sciences and all that, practice questions are really important. Write your own, get practice questions, past exams. get all of that. Really, really important. Yeah, the others you can kind of read again. Don't worry about definitions. That's like a little bit I've kind of talked about. Teaching and talking to others. I used to do this all the time. I think my family probably hated me, but especially because I was in year 11. Like psych was my first 3-4. I wasn't really that sure about how 3-4s work. But in saying that, it was still helpful, and I'm pretty sure I still did it in year 12 to at least my sister. But I would literally just have my notes and I would just teach them about the topic, because you can't teach someone a topic that you don't know. So if there's a point and you're trying to teach them, and then you get to a point and you're like, actually, I don't really know about this. Yay, you figured out where you need to study. So yeah, I found that really helpful. Obviously, everybody has different learning styles, but that's something that can be really helpful. Even just create a study group. If you have other friends in psych or anything like that, that can be really helpful. Okay, I think I've mentioned some of this stuff in phone textbooks. I've talked about that, practice questions. Yeah, and I talked about this at the start in terms of putting effort in. You can do quite well. I'd say psych, okay, again, take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I'd say psych is one of the subjects where you can score quite well if you put in a decent amount of effort. Like, you don't have to put in the most effort you've ever put in to score well, if that makes sense, is what I'd sort of say. But I think practice questions are really a good way of figuring that out, because if you're getting the mark or not, that sort of tells you where you're going. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I think this is the last slide we have here. So when you guys do get into your practice exams a little bit later on, command terms, super important. Making a log of your common mistakes, using your marking scheme, using your lines as sort of guidance. As a general rule of thumb, the 10 marker, I think I spent about half an hour, I want to say. Yeah. Again, previous study design may be a little bit different. VCAR doesn't have a sample exam out, but they do have 2 10 markers up they've given for this study design. And I think they are a little bit more research based, honestly. But yeah, I would probably say half an hour-ish. Practice your multiple choice as well. Multiple choice, again, I know with the previous study design, there was about 50 multiple choice questions, so it's quite a high number. So get confident in both your multiple choice and your short answer question sort of technique. Okay, I think I've covered most of that stuff. Again, if anything, just leave it in the chat. Hopefully I've answered it already. Or if anything as well, you can feel free to email me. Hopefully it's linked on the page, but it's just lourdes@tutesmart.com is my email. So feel free to send me anything if you've got any questions that you'd prefer to ask me personally or that we didn't get time for. Feel free to go ahead. But otherwise, I won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully that was helpful. And good luck with everything. I'm sure you guys will do really, really well in psych. And good luck with any of your other 3-4 subjects if you've got them as well. Thanks, guys. Bye.